So as I was saying to Dr. Boswell, this book was one of the first ones I bought when I got my new job. My background is in public art and engagement and talking about meaning and place. But I'm new to history. And so this book was my textbook. It was the first one I read, and I just devoured it, and I've been reading and learning about history since. So Dr. Boswell is the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Henderson State University in Arkadelphia, Arkansas. But why isn't someone from Arkansas writing a book on Texas history? Well, she was born and raised in Houston, Texas, and she did her bachelor's degree in English and history at Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas. And then she did her master's degree and Ph.D. Study at Rice University back in Houston. And currently at the Anderson State University in Arkansas, she supervises 130 faculty members at a college of 3,500 students. Dr. Boswell, please take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm so very honored that you have asked me to give this talk. Originally, we planned for me to come to Austin and give it in person, but as we all know, the rest of the rest of the world has gone crazy. So at first I thought that I was not coming down to Austin to protect myself because y'all had it so bad there. But as it turns out, Arkansas is in a bit of a spike right now. So it's probably good I'm not bringing you my germs. So with that said, I'm so very happy to be able to do this virtually, and got a couple of people not in Austin joining as a result. So that's very good. Jennifer wanted me to talk to you a little bit about how I came to write this book and why I came to write this book. And really, I started writing this book because I was asked to. The executive editor at Texas A&M University Press came to me and said, it's time to have a narrative of women in Texas history. And the reason is that beginning in the late 60s, early 70s, women in Texas started researching their history. And Texas as a state, I think, was farther ahead than most women historians, most historians at all in the nation, in studying women in the state. We had a lot of women's history being written in the 1970s. Up to that point, we really didn't have very much written about women and women's history. So women started writing in the 1970s. Women and men started writing women's history of Texas in the 1970s and have been doing so very actively since then. And so there were enough monographs, enough special studies that Mary Lynn Dixon at Texas A&M Press said it was time to weave them all into one narrative. Now I thought, wow, that sounds really good. Everybody's written such good stories, good histories. All I have to do is read them all and, summarize them. It turned out to be a much more challenging task than that, in that there are some areas that are very, very well researched and written, and there are others that just are not. And it was very important to me to cover the whole chronology, to cover all races and ethnicities, to cover all women. I don't do so equally in this book, I will admit that, because I was relying a great deal on what had already been written. But I attempted to do so because I wanted to tell the whole story of women. Now, one reason that this book was also necessary is that even though historians have been writing about women's history since the 1970s, as I write in the preface to the book, the mythic narrative of Texas history has long emphasized the iconic cowboy taming the frontier, men fighting valiantly against foes to win glory for themselves and the state, and politicians engaged in debates in which personal and ideological differences played out, shaping the idiosyncrasies of state laws and economics. Such myth not only omits the women from those activities, it conceals the reality of women's lived experiences, their histories. And I think that is very, very Texas, but it's also describes history in general. Up until very recently, history was really about politics or war, and that was what was defined as history. And so women weren't very involved in politics and war until, of course, they got the vote in 1920, which is also one of the reasons that this is such an important celebration, women entering politics. And so, well, absolutely, I celebrate that. I certainly want to write about that. But I also wanted to write about women's history, what women were doing even in this period. So I began the book with a really simple premise, is that what women did in the past is intrinsically worth knowing, and that Texas would not be Texas without one half of its population. So I tried to knit their stories and tell their stories. And some of their stories are well known, but most of them are not well known and part of the Texas narrative. From the very beginning, women were very, very active. They were doing things, and going back even to the Native Americans. There were many different Native American groups before the Europeans even knew there was a place such as Texas, and they had a variety of political arrangements and living situations. But amongst the Caddo, for instance, men were chiefs, it's true, but women directed the daily affairs of the household, where most decisions were made. And so women were the ones who were doing the harvesting. They were the ones who divided the food. They gathered the food, they divided it, they decided who got it. And so they ran the households. A Spanish missionary, upon coming across the Caddo, a Spanish missionary arranged with the male chief. Of course, the Spanish are going to be dealing with the men. And he arranged with the chief to live in the chief's household. The chief agreed. But when the chief told the women of his house his plans, they refused. And since they were head of the household, much to the surprise of the missionary, the chief heeded their wishes and told the missionary he couldn't stay. So from the very beginning, we've got these women who were active, who were part of not always politics, but they were still making a difference, making decisions of their own and making a difference in the way that the history of Texas unfolded. By the time the Spanish arrived in Texas, what we know as Texas now, by the time the Spanish arrived and began settlements, women were also very active there as well. It was very important to have women to have permanent settlements. They sent male priests, they sent male soldiers, but to actually have an established settlement, you needed women. And so the women who were willing to go to this far-flung, scary, dangerous area were strong women, and they often did unusual things. Widowhood, in their widowhood, we had several women in this Spanish period that actually ranched and farmed and on their own. When she was a widow, by 1798, Rosa Maria Hinojosa de Bali had acquired about 1/3 of the lower Rio Grande Valley, about 643,000 acres, and she became one of the first cattle queens of Texas. And she did all of this after the death of her husband. While the Spanish period did settle parts of Texas and did move into Texas, they in no way really dominated Texas. Native Americans still remained dominant during the Spanish period. And as a result, during the Mexican period, they invited some Anglos to come in and perhaps settle Texas a little bit better and push back the Native Americans, especially the Comanches, who were threatening the Mexican settlements. As we know, these Anglo-Texans eventually decided they didn't want to be part of Mexico anymore. And in this period, we have the Texas Revolution. But before the Texas Revolution, and even after, in this incredibly unsettled time, what you have are people who are moving west. And this is where we get that myth of the iconic man who's going out as an individual and taming the frontier. But he wasn't doing this alone. And he was taking, they were taking some very strong women. Some very strong women were going there. And what were these women doing? Well, some of them clearly were picking up the guns and fighting as well, because they were left at home at times and they had to protect themselves. But women were also taking care of the families, allowing the families to grow and to survive. Mary Rabb, for instance, she and her husband moved to Texas, and they ended up moving 6 times. First, they moved someplace and it was too crowded for her husband, so they moved someplace else, which was completely isolated. And then he would go for weeks at a time elsewhere, and she was left alone with her children in a makeshift tent, protecting her children. And what else was she doing? She was spinning and weaving, because women were having to grow the gardens, feed the children, produce the food, and clothe the people. And this isn't happening easily. They couldn't go to stores to do this. So Rab remembered that many times when she was alone, she went many times and took my gun and lay in the corner of the fence and helped watch for Indians. At night, sometimes when her husband was gone, she would stay up spinning all night long, just keeping the spinning wheel going. 1, because, well, she needed cloth, but 2, because the spinning wheel drowned out the noises outside, and so she couldn't hear the Native Americans who might be prowling around and threatening her in the middle of the night. As soon as she would get one place settled, they would pick up and move again. And this was not atypical for these types of families who were trying to find land in order to settle and live and make a fortune, they hoped, but at least to make a living. Now, most women, almost all women, came to Texas in this early period in family groups. They came with their husbands. Some came reluctantly, but most were part of this desire to do something better for their family. Joanna Dunlap, I think, is an excellent example of the spirit of these Texas women. She came with her husband and their 10 children to Texas from New York. All right, so you already know she has lived quite a life if she has 10 children, and they pick up and they move to Texas. In Texas, a family could get over 1,000 acres of land and homestead it. This would be great for, 10 children to raise and to give them an inheritance. 3 months after arriving in Texas and claiming their land, her husband died. And so now Joanna is left in Texas on this farm with 10 children. Well, women in this period of time are expected to marry. They're expected to play a part in a family as a wife. And this was also, they had not started clearing the land. They had not made any money. So she's looking for, what does she do? Well, fortunately in Texas, there are more men than women. At one point in some counties, there were 3 to 4 men per woman. And so it's not hard for her to do what? To get married again. And so she remarries really quickly, and she marries Joe Crabb. And Joe Crabb, don't know anything really much about him, except that he died 2 months later, and she's pregnant with her 11th child. So after burying her second husband, Joe McCrabb, I'm guessing she married the first guy who came along, and this was William Dunlap. And the marriage to William Dunlap was obviously very unhappy. Now, coming from the South, and now Joanna did not come from the South, she came from New York, but most of the Anglos who moved to Texas were from Southern states, and they brought their ideas about women's place and law from the South. And so when William Dunlap eventually abandons Joanna after trying to take all of her property and money and informing her he actually was married to 2 other women, he finally abandons her. But because there was no mechanism for divorce yet, Joanna couldn't get remarried. So Joanna, with 11 children now, has to figure out what to do. Well, she traded her homestead in for town lots. She sold and resold town lots. She started buying and selling things. She started acting as a trader and made money to support her family. And at some point she met the justice of the peace, but that's just a moment. I'll get to that story. But so she's doing fairly well. The problem is that she's actually a married woman still. And under Texas law, married women weren't allowed to buy and sell and trade and sign contracts or do any of these things without the permission of her husband. Well, Joanna Dunlap, finally, Texas, in 1840, does pass a law allowing for divorce, and allowing for divorce in the local court area. Now, this is part of what's interesting about Texas, is that even though it's very southern, it's also western. And one of the things that you will note about western states is that they tended to be a little bit more progressive in some of these laws, and more progressive came into divorce. South Carolina did not allow divorce till 1960s, whereas Texas, 1840, began allowing divorce for 3 reasons, one of which was abandonment. Joanna went to court, and turns out that her now grown oldest son was the foreman of the jury in this case, but she was granted a divorce from William Dunlap, and 2 days later she married the justice of the peace, Jacob Tipps. I'll give you some good news. She outlives Jacob Tipps as well, so she gets to bury him as well, but they were together for another 30 years before that happened. And apparently it was a good marriage, but what happens is all of the transactions that she made while she was a married woman, they kept going to court. Jacob Tipps and Joanna Tipps now would go to court saying, we're not going to uphold this part of the contract because she was a married woman when she signed it. And the court would say, yes, but she was acting as a single woman and ruled against them. And then other people would go to court. It would benefit us to say that she was a married woman and couldn't contract, and they would rule against Jacob and Joanna. So no matter that the laws were allowing her to do some certain things, it was clear that the laws were still acting as if it was important for her to be subservient to some man. But this is what the fluid nature of Texas is going to be like in this early period. And you're going to have other, remarkable women who will buck the trends, such as Sally Skull, who actually begins, let's say, herding cattle, not rustling them, surely not, but they're where they came from and how she obtained them was not always clear, but she headed up a team of cowboys who herded cattle, and during the Civil War herded them down to Mexico in order to make money. Now, even though East Texas was very fluid, it also became very Southern. As I said, most of the people who moved there were from Southern states. And after more people moved there, and one thing would happen is that one family would move there and they would tell their family back home how wonderful it was, and then family would move. And so you would have these whole family groups that relocated in areas of Texas. So once you had family and stores to go to and society and religion and churches and all of that being established in an area, women in Texas became more and more Southern. They followed the same sort of trends that they did in the South. And they upheld those same sort of ideals, down to women should be subservient not only to God, but to her husband. And religion becomes very, very important in their lives. And in these diaries that you'll read from women, you will see this combination of religion being very important to them, but also social mores and what people think of them. And Sally McNeil wrote in her diary, this was just a tremendous problem for her, and she goes back to it several times. But one day in church, after church, she asked the preacher's wife to come over for lunch. And the preacher's wife nodded, but was not committed immediately. And then she suddenly decided to accompany Mrs. W without the slightest apology or excuse to me. Now, when you compare Sally McNeil's terrible, terrible life to, of course, Joanna Dunlap's, 30 years earlier, there's not much comparison. But nonetheless, it became very important in society, because to Sally McNeil, this wasn't just a personal, this mean girl, I didn't get to do this. This meant that Mrs. W was higher in society than Sally McNeil. And this meant a great deal for who Sally McNeil might be able to marry, what her situation in life would be in the future. Being very Southern, and as the area and again, we're talking mostly East Texas here, as East Texas, they are growing cotton and they're bringing in their Southern ideals. One of those ideals you have to remember is slavery. And so slave women were brought to Texas. They didn't volunteer. They were brought to Texas, and they were the ones that made Sally McNeil's life possible and made Mrs. W's life possible and their position in society possible. But these women, unlike the elite women in the South, they had to work in the fields. It was definitely for white women, it was very important not to have to work. That was a status. But they expected African American women to work. And Irella Battle Walker remembered that when I was still little, I went to the fields. I could pick about 150 pounds a day when I was 12. And children in slavery grew up, and these women grew up, and their mothers had to go to the fields and pick or hoe cotton. Then they would go to the house at night and spin for the clothing for the master. And of course, then they would have to take care of their own families. And so life was incredibly difficult still for African Americans, even as Southern society became more settled. Now, the Civil War going to make a major change, bringing freedom for the slaves. Millie Ann Smith of Rusk County said, most on to 4 years after the war, 3 men come to Master George and makes him call us up and turn us loose. I heard him say it's close on to 4 years we were free, but that was the first we knew about it. So the Civil War did indeed free the slaves, but in Texas was one of the last places to know about it. And of course, June 19th was when the the proclamation was read in Texas saying that all slaves in Texas were freed. And that was supposedly the last group that heard about it. But for those who were able to keep outsiders away from their plantations, they were able to convince the people working on their plantations that they were still enslaved. Freedom for the slaves also meant some changes for those who had depended upon them. And there is the wonderful woman who, by the way, if you ever get a chance, go back and read 19th century divorce petitions. They're just so fascinating. But in this particular divorce petition, Ellen Lacey was filing for divorce from her husband. And you get this beautiful picture in her description, because after freedom, there were no slaves to take care of the family. And Ellen Lacey had to go and make breakfast, something to which she was not accustomed, she says in her petition. And her husband began laughing at her and making fun of her. And so this is part of her petition for divorce. Now, it turns out that he also, upon occasion would take a stick and beat her, which in Texas, depending on what class of woman you were, that was good. That was not a good idea. If you were an upper class woman, according to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, upper class women could take just insults or cross words as cruelty, whereas lower class women were often used to violence and abuse, and so hitting them with a stick didn't necessarily warrant them getting a divorce. So in in Ellen's case, she thought that these crosswords as well. She lost her divorce, but it had nothing to do with that. But you still get this picture of how difficult things were going to be without the slaves for these women who were accustomed to it. Now, after the Civil War, you have a lot of people who had depended upon slavery, and now they had land but no workers. And one of the things that will happen in East Texas is the rise of sharecropping and tenant farming. And eventually, not only will this be a way for to keep African Americans growing cotton, but it will, because of the financial situation of the state, it will draw most white farmers into the system as well. And by the end of the century, you're going to have the majority of farmers do not own their land. They're working for other people, and they have to promise a portion of the cotton crop. And very, very often at the end of the year, they owe more money than they get in cotton, and they have no choice but to then grow more cotton again. So this is happening in East Texas. Now, what's happening in West Texas, however, after the Civil War is that, well, there is still land in West Texas. All right, those of you who live in West Texas can probably understand why there had not been a rush to start farming in West Texas before this point. Flat and dry, and at this point they believed that there were no trees on the land, it couldn't support a family. But after the Civil War, they began discovering that it probably could. And so there were families who were trying to recover from the Civil War, families trying to get ahead, just as they had been in the early years of Texas, who were moving out to West Texas. Now, in West Texas, they didn't have tents, or they didn't have a lot of wood to make makeshift housing. So some of the makeshift housing that they started with were dugouts. They would dig into a hill, basically, and live in the hill. And then they would cover it with thatch roofs or and enclose it that way. Now, some of these dugouts, they got quite elaborate, and they were large. And the women who lived there and moved there, they tried to make them as homey as possible. This is what women are supposed to do, make it like home. They would make them as homey as possible. And one woman described going to visit a family, and they even had a library in their dugout situation. But then you also have poor little Edith Pitts. Edith Pitts, who trying to make this place homey, she had prepared a very special meal for her husband and several friends. She had a dinner party in her dugout, and she had set the table and was ready to eat when a steer walked across the sod roof and broke through the ceiling, leaving its leg dangling above the table and dirt pouring into the house, ruining the dinner. So women had a tough time in West Texas trying to recreate what they thought home should be like. Ella Bird talks about learning how to shoot a gun in West Texas, standing up to Native Americans, staying alone for days, but still taking pride in the cleanliness of her teepee. Scarcity, resourcefulness, less adherence to tradition in the West were all reasons that Western states later were more likely to grant more rights to women, including suffrage. Now, only part of Texas was West Texas. The rest of Texas was Southern. But that West Texas and that Western spirit really permeated a great deal of life and thought for women in western part of the state. Now, since I brought up suffrage, and since this is in conjunction with the exhibit to vote here, suffrage in Texas is the story of suffrage in Texas is a mixture of Southern suffrage movements and Western suffrage movements. It very much is. As you may know, in the North, women had started a suffrage campaign back in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. That was 1848, and Northern women had active suffrage movement pretty much. They split and then they got back together by 1890. But they were active. There were some women actively engaged in fighting for the right to vote. In Texas, you did not have any women actively engaged until well after the Civil War. During the Reconstruction, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, you had this period where they were considering one of the members of the Constitutional Committee actually proposed giving women the right to vote. And they debated it, and they, of course, voted it down. But there's no evidence even at that point that there were any women who were advocating for their own right to vote. This was all done in the Constitutional Convention. But some of the things that will happen after the Civil War that will get women involved in Texas and in the South, more involved in talking about, is one, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The Women's Christian Temperance Union began in the North, but it had a lot of followers in the South. Southern women wanted men to stop drinking almost as much as Northern women wanted men to stop drinking. And so the Women's Christian Temperance Union did come to Texas several times, and there was an active anti-drinking campaign in Texas. The Women's Christian Temperance Union endorsed suffrage. And again, they endorsed suffrage thinking that if women had the right to vote, then they would outlaw alcohol. When they endorsed suffrage, the Women's Christian Temperance Union actually lost a lot of support in Texas. But that doesn't mean that there weren't women who still thought that. Also in Texas, again, many families had fallen into tenant farming and sharecropping. Many other farm families are trying very hard to hold on to their land. And one of the major organizations that would arise in this period was the Farmers Alliance. And the Farmers Alliance was trying to help farmers hold on to their land. They were advocating for more currency so that the people could pay back their debts. They also were having meetings in every small community throughout the state, whether West Texas, East Texas, everywhere. And this Farmers Alliance was unique in many ways in that in these meetings, they were inviting women. Even though the Farmers Alliance turned very political, women were played an incredibly important role. They went with their husbands to the meetings, they participated in the meetings, and they wrote frequently to the Southern Mercury, which was the Farmers Alliance magazine. They pointed to the women thinkers, and they said, nature has endowed women with brains. Why should she not think? Why not act? And in the 1880s, the Southern Mercury debated the subject of woman suffrage, with more letters leaning towards granting women the right to vote than not. These are rural people who are advocating for women's right to vote. Betty Gay of Columbus and Ellen Lawson Dabbs of North Texas were both elected from Texas to attend the National Convention to form a new political party. They were delegates to a political party in the 1880s and 1890s. So women in Texas were getting out there and doing things. Well, the Farmers Alliance fell apart in the late 1890s and did not mount a major third party. But you could see that even in the rural areas, you had some women who were willing to fight for suffrage. Most suffrage movements, and this is why it began, one reason it began in the North rather than the South, is that most suffrage movements came as a result of women living in urban areas and being able to work with each other to form organizations. And they formed organizations, and from those organizations they would discover that they became political. And one of the things that is going to happen in Texas is very much the same. The more Texas urbanized, the more active organizations that Texas women became involved in, the more likely they were to support suffrage. In 1894, you had a suffrage organization formed in Texas, but it basically, urban versus rural women didn't see eye to eye, and it dissolved. By 1903, Annette Finnegan and two of her sisters in Galveston formed yet another suffrage organization in Texas, but they couldn't find women that weren't too timid to organize. And Annette Finnegan moved to New York in 1905, and the president of the Texas Woman Suffrage Association lived in New York for the next 10 years. So this is how the movement in Texas is not gaining a lot of steam. But what you do see in the late 1800s and the early 1900s is a women's club movement. And the women's club movement, mostly urban areas. And let me say something, when in the early 20th century, when we're talking urban areas, we're talking towns of 2,000 or more, okay? So what we would consider rural today, but it was still urban at that time. But women in urban areas began having Shakespeare clubs or mothers clubs, ways for women to get together and talk about a subject, whether it be literature or how to become a better mother. And as they were doing this, the women's club movements are the ones that will form libraries. The vast majority of public libraries in Texas were formed by women, are founded by women, and founded by women's clubs. And they would found them, and then they would turn them over to the local authorities. But so this is some of the things they're doing. They're involved in the schools and making the schools better. But one of the things that will happen is all of these little clubs began joining the Texas Federation of Women Clubs. They confederated together, and they joined the General Federation of Women's Clubs, the national organization. And in Texas, they start studying in their study clubs. They get ideas from the national and the state, and one of the ideas was to study laws regarding women. And a women's club member, Hortense Ward, would write the legal status of married women. And this would lead to a change, actually, as the women began arguing for change in married women's property law in 1913. Pauline Periwinkle wrote for the Dallas Morning News for 2 decades. She was a member of the Women's Club, and she says, "I'm a firm believer that good accrues from woman's familiarizing herself with affairs that affect her immediate community first, her state next, and her country ultimately. Good both to the woman and the object of her inquiry." So we've moved now from women's responsibility being to her family, and therefore being in the home, being subservient, and all of the work that they had to do in the home, to also saying, hey, it is our responsibility as women to make the country better, because that makes our children better. And they start at the local, asking for clean milk ordinances. Hey, at the local level, shouldn't we have clean water, because that kind of affects my children too? And so they are arguing from the point of view of being a mother that they should be involved in politics and have a position. Anna Pennybacker, sorry, in 1912, she was a Texas woman, and in 1912, she won a heated campaign for president of the General Federation of Women's Clubs. And to us, this sounds like, okay, so it's a voluntary club that she won but this was the highest office a woman could hold in the United States at the time. And they campaigned as rigorously as the president, as campaign for president. They learned how to organize and engage in politics. And so one of the things that will happen as a result of this Federation of Women's Clubs is that women learn how to organize. They also learn how to lobby and get laws made. And they learn that they also need the vote in order to have real power to shape the world. And so by 1915, there is a new Texas Equal Suffrage Association. And by 1915, it had 2,500 members, 21 locals. Minnie Fisher Cunningham would arise as a major leader, and she remembered that she had floated into the suffrage movement on a sea of bad milk. She had joined the groups of women who were arguing to improve sanitation in their areas. And these women knew how to organize women to action. They knew training schools, how to lobby, and they did so. And so their strategy was to focus on a federal amendment. Now, as they're focusing on this federal amendment, the Texas Equal Suffrage Association is working with the National American Woman Suffrage Association in order to get a federal amendment getting women the right to vote. But at the national level, the suffragists were determined that they needed southern states in order for this amendment to pass. So Texas plays a big role in this. But part of getting southern states so that they can pass the amendment is to recognize that southern states will never enfranchise Black women. And so they are specifically left out. And when Maud Sampson, as Jennifer was talking about Maud Sampson earlier, one of the women buried in Oakwood Cemetery, as Maud Sampson's club in El Paso was a suffrage club, she asked to join the Texas Equal Suffrage Association. But Carrie Chapman Catt of the General Federation of Women's Clubs informed Maud Sampson that TESA will be able to get the vote for women more easily if you do not embarrass them by asking for membership. And so the TESA did not include Black women or Mexican American women in their fight for the suffrage. Well, the TESA was indeed successful. They organized women. They promised support for Hobby, who was president. He was not president, Governor Hobby, who was running for re-election against Jim Ferguson, who had been impeached. They promised support for Hobby if Hobby would support their right to vote. And indeed, Hobby did support the right for women's vote, and the women came through for Hobby. On March 26, 1918, Texas passed a law allowing women to vote in primary elections only. This was 16 days before voter registration for the primary closed, and the Texas Equal Suffrage Association were able to get 386,000 women registered to vote in those 16 days. And they turned out, and Hobby did win the re-election. But being able to vote in the primary in Texas, since there was really only one political party, for the most part, they got to choose who the candidates were, but still it was not full suffrage. And Texas joined the national organization to work for the 19th Amendment. The national president, Carrie Chapman Catt, referred to the people in Texas, to the women who were working for suffrage in Texas, she referred to them as the heavy artillery down in Texas. And as a result of their work, both Texas senators voted for the 19th Amendment. And when the 19th Amendment was sent to Texas, Texas became the first southern state to ratify it. Now, winning the vote, the 19th Amendment, and then Minnie Fisher Cunningham and others worked at the national level. They all converged on Tennessee and convinced Tennessee to become the last state to ratify it, so that women had the right to vote in the Constitution. But that right to vote in the Constitution, just to reiterate something said earlier, it gave white women the right to vote. And Black women still did not have the right to vote. Between literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and poll taxes, they were still kept away from the polls. They were not allowed to vote. And not really until 1944, when the Supreme Court outlawed the private primary. Because the Democratic primary in Texas was considered to be a private organization, they could discriminate and keep Blacks from voting. And as I said before, only the Democrats had a chance of winning the offices. So 1944 was the first chance for African Americans at all to vote, but they were still kept away from the polls until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Mexican American women were actually had even more trouble getting the vote. It was the 1970s until they were guaranteed that right for sure. But what did women do with the vote? One of the things that we read about in our male mythic history textbooks is women got the right to vote, and then we don't hear anything else about them until much later. But women got the right to vote, and they were still as active in doing as many things as they had been before. Some of them were running for public office. Annie Webb Blanton became the first woman elected to statewide office in that very first election that women were allowed to vote in. A couple of women were elected to the Texas House of Representatives in 1922. Minnie Fisher Cunningham ran for Senate. But one of the other things that women were doing, they were less successful at winning office, but they were more successful in other ways. One of the things they did is they formed lobby groups. Now that they had the right to vote, they could pressure legislators. And there were 6 women's organizations that formed together in a coalition. And in that coalition, which was nicknamed the Petticoat Lobby, they were able to pass all 6 of their bills in 1923. They supported the Shepherd-Towner Act that provided prenatal and infant care, especially to rural areas. these women were still active. They were still doing things. Now they were doing it at the state level, not just at the local level, getting clean milk. Now, depression and war would interfere, but women still were politically active, mostly through the business and professional women. And the business and professional women were supporting women's right to go into professions and supporting women's rights in politics. From the business and professional women, you get women like Judge Sarah T. Hughes, who was the 6th woman to serve in the state legislature. And she also became Texas' first federal judge in 1961, which put her in a position to swear in Lyndon B. Johnson after Kennedy was assassinated. Because the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court typically swears in the president, this means that Sarah Hughes is the only woman to ever swear in a president of the United States. I could go on and on and on and on and on, as you can tell, about what women did with the right to vote after that. And women did stay very, very active. It isn't just a matter of suddenly in the 1970s, women woke up and said, hey, we have the right to vote, maybe we should do about it, and began the civil rights movements and fighting for the ERA. That's not exactly how it happened. But for a lot of young women who were never taught this history of how women got the right to vote, and they never learned this history of what women were doing with the right to vote, in the 1970s, as young women, it was all a mystery to them. It was as if they were recreating the wheel, which again is one of the reasons that it's so important to study and read about women's history. And so I encourage you to keep doing that. All right, I talked a long time. I'd love to talk to you and see what questions you have.
What was your process working on the book like? How long did it take?
Oh, well, the press gave me a deadline of 2 years to finish the book. I missed the deadline by 10 years. It literally took me almost 12 years from the time I started working on it until it was finished. It just became a major project. And the more that I worked on it, the more that I wanted it to be complete. I think originally it was just going to be a sort of bare bones, vague narrative. And the more I got into it and was looking at all of this that hadn't been really said before, I decided that it needed to be complete. Now, fortunately, Texas A&M University Press was very, very, very patient with me. And every time I would say, I'm not done yet, they were very understanding, saying, do it right, get it right. And I don't know that I got it right, but if it is anything close to right, it's because of their support in me writing this. But after a while, when you're working on a book for 10 years and you have other projects going on, and oh yeah, you're also teaching and becoming an administrator, literally it got to the point where what I would do is I got up every morning and I would write for an hour or two every day. And before anything else could impede on my mind and distract me from it. And when I started doing that, instead of trying to get it, a whole chapter done this weekend, that never worked. Literally just writing every day was the only way that it ever got finished. So,
what inspired you to pursue a career as a historian focusing on women?
Well, when I was as an undergraduate, I was going to be an English high school teacher. That was my goal going to college. I very quickly decided that was not going to happen, but I'm so grateful. I wanted to do that at one point because that was the reason I went to college. I'm a first-generation college student. And so I went to college so I could become an English teacher, and English was my love. at my first major, and then I minored in history. And one of the things I discovered is close to graduation is, oh, if I just take nothing but history this last semester, I can double major. So that's how I became, quote unquote, a historian. And then after that, I went into the world, and I worked for about 5 years out in the world. And I decided I liked academia a lot more than I remembered it, and I wanted to go back to it. But one of the things that I did out in the world is I was executive director of the Texas Women's Political Caucus for 3 years. And being the director of the Women's Political Caucus really did a couple of things to me. It emphasized how interesting what women have been doing, and also how little we've known about it, how little is written about it, and how important it is to know our history. And so when I decided to go back to graduate school, I chose history, and I chose women's history. That was what motivated me. And I'm a Southerner, so Southern American women's history was my specialization.
Here's another question from Shirley Derryberry. Was there a definite line between East Texas women and West?
A definite line between East Texas and West Texas. Now, that line moved, and it was gradual. But if you look at East Texas versus West Texas, and I-35 is a good place to divide East Texas versus West Texas. East Texas, again, was much more wedded to Southern traditions and to cotton growing, and still remains from that heritage. West Texas was wide open. I mean, you had the borderlands where you had large ranches and heritage from the Mexican and Spanish eras, up to West Texas, where West Texas, parts of West Texas were still frontier after Frederick Jackson Turner had declared the frontier had closed. I mean, so it's a very varied place. So I talk about East Texas versus West Texas, but really, truly, there are so many divisions in Texas, and so many ways that you could describe Texas. I mean, Central Texas is a little east and a little west, but it's also, in and of itself, just a unique place. So I hope that answers your question, Shirley.
From Joe Solomon, and then I'm going to add to it a part 2 from me. What was your favorite part of the history to write about? And part 2 from me, because the level of literal work and chores is very overwhelming when I read your book. For you, what part of the history was the hardest part to write about? So what was your favorite part, and what was your hardest part?
My favorite part is going to probably be about West Texas. And that is also the same reason as what my least favorite was. So I was, my Ph.D. is in American history. My dissertation was on Southern women, particularly in Texas, before and after the Civil War. I wrote about it. I published a book on it. I wrote about 6, 7, 8 articles. I don't know how many on that era. And so when it came time to write the book, I was tired of that, and I couldn't think of anything new to say. And just writing about it, even though this was my area of specialization, was just so incredibly boring. And that, I think, has got to be some of the hardest part to write about. Whereas West Texas, I knew some about, but not that much. And so the more I was reading these diaries and reading these histories of West Texas, and I was learning things, when I read about the steer leg falling into Edith Pitt's dugout, I howled, and I started calling everyone I knew just to repeat that story. So that, to me, probably was the most fun to write about.
Makes sense. From Joshua Shannon, apologize if I've gotten your name wrong, which I'm sure I did. Hey, Dr. Boswell, what advice would you give those who are writing their first book and thinking about doing a PhD?
I would say that if you really love history and want to write about history, that I would recommend going and getting your PhD. I mean, absolutely. I have no regrets. It was, for me, this was just the process of getting the PhD. It started off a little rocky, I'll admit, but the whole process of it, I will never forget. It was some of the most challenging and rewarding periods of my time, most formative. And so I think that it's a great idea. And as far as if you're considering writing your first book, do it. Don't just keep thinking about it and thinking that you're going to do it. Is decide to do it. And you don't have to start at the beginning. I probably spent a few months thinking about my first chapter before I sat down to write it. And I believe firmly it's important to sort of to think through and let all that cogitate. But you got to put words on paper. And once I put the words on paper, I realized, wow, I don't know this part. I don't know about this. I don't know about this. And then I could go back and I could do more research. But until I sat down to write, I didn't know any of that. So all of that thinking was good, but it wasn't complete. And so put the words on paper. Then if you don't have anything else to say at that point, let it cogitate. It's okay to do a little at a time. So that would be my recommendation from my point of view. I also have one of my former students who he absolutely loves to write, and he will just sit down for a whole weekend and write straight through. And if he didn't have to eat or drink, he would never stop. So it depends some on your personality, but I think he's more of the odd person than I am. But
so speaking of, this is one of my big questions is you write what you know, but you're writing also from the perspective of women of color in different groups and in different times. So how did you get that information peer reviewed and have its tires kicked about how that sounded and what the voices conveyed?
Well, one of the things I did is I relied a lot upon secondary sources and, those that have been published and peer reviewed. And so this was my guiding, is that I would read and carefully, and I would use what other published historians had said and done and how they interpreted it. That was very key. But, and this was the secret to my success, is that for every chapter I wrote, actually every half chapter, I gave to a writers group here on campus, which was very diverse. I think there was one other historian in it. It was everyone from all over campus, and there was diversity in race there as well. And they read it and they said, yeah, this is boring, or this doesn't make sense, or wow, you talk about this like everyone knows, but not being from Texas, I've never heard of this. So, and I would go back and I would rewrite, and then I would send it to a historian friend after I had, rewritten it. And I'm smiling at one right now. Jean Stuntz read, I think, 2 of my chapters, but I would send it to another historian or 2 who would then comment on it and go back and rewrite. So each of those chapters went through 6 or 7 drafts. And then when sent off the whole book, the press asked me who I wanted to read the manuscript, and I chose 2 of the most thorough and critical women's historians I could think of, and they went through it line by line, and I will always be incredibly grateful to them for doing that. So I had a lot of help.
Thank you so very much. Just a deep, inspiring project, and I am grateful to get to be acquainted, and I hope to continue working with you in the future on some history research projects. So thank you so much, and enjoy your August afternoon.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was good to see you.